week, Sister Faustina and the Divine Mercy. Now, I think we've all heard of the Chaplet of Divine Mercy, and so I'm not going to dig too deeply into the actual chaplet because it's relatively well known. It's prayed on the beads of the rosary. It's significantly shorter and simpler. There are no mysteries, properly speaking, to contemplate. It was given to Sister Faustina very directly and very clearly by our Lord. It was formally structured by her spiritual director, Father Michael, Polish name, and that was in the mid-1930s. Now, let me just say up front, there's a lot of Polish names here. I've got none of them. None of them are pronounceable because Polish has all these little lines and marks, and it takes an L to a W, and it takes a C to an M, and it's completely incomprehensible. So I'm going to have a whole lot of Polish names, or I'm going to have the city that is pronounced in the most gringo way possible. The actual town that she kind of came up in is called Łódź. I'm going to pronounce it as Lodz, L-O-D-Z, because that's the way it looks to us. We don't have to be Polish, and I can't speak Polish, and I was there for a week, and I still have nothing. The only word I said properly is the word for yes, which is tak. That's it. So it's going to have a whole lot of Polish name, and Father Michael Polish name is the spiritual director of Sister Faustina, and so she and he are going to be the two main players of our story, and that'll just have to be good enough. Now, at the same time, there is a third Polish name that we all know how to pronounce correctly because then Bishop Karol Wojtyła, who, in the 1960s, promoted the Chaplet of Divine Mercy, and it was a great deal of his work that brought it to the Universal Church, and of course he would go on to become Pope St. John Paul II. The story, though, of how all this stuff came together is a little more complicated than it might immediately seem, and some parts of it are really worth knowing. And so this is not just kind of me indulging my interest in history. There's some parts of this that are really quite relevant. And so let's start with just a little bit of context. Sister Faustina was born Elena Kowalska in Polish town Głogowicz in central Poland in 1905. Okay, so she's born in 1905. Now, most of us don't know our Polish history very well. It's a very complicated history. Goes back to St. Stephen, St. Wenceslaus, way, way back when. But if we go back to the 1800s, Poland has been a near constant battlefield. There was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there were intra-Slavic wars, there were the Germans, there were the Russians. It was just all over the place. And the poor Poles just wanted to be independent. And that was not in the cards for most of the last 200 years. And so even though they had this kind of great dream, it was not realized. And many of the Poles were at the position of going, we're never going to be able to be free. Now, Faustina enters the convent in 1926, and when she does, Poland is a complete and total mess. It had been gutted of money. It had been gutted of men, which is a big deal. Not just people, generally speaking, but fathers of families just weren't there. There weren't men to do work, and so the labor market was a mess. There were a lot of people coming in from the outside. There was just a great deal of mess, culturally speaking. And also there was incredibly low morale. But still, as this is happening, the Polish people are kind of holding on tighter than ever to their own culture, which was a deeply religious culture. And despite all the mess of the Treaty of Versailles and all that kind of stuff, and the fact that they were being threatened from all sides, the Polish people were really trying to kind of hold on to their faith as the only stabilizing force. Well, after Faustina does her thing, World War II, of course, shows up on the scene. That's horrific. The Nazis occupy Poland, and they had barely left town before the Russians took their place. There are the concentration camps to dismantle. Of the 20 or so million people who were murdered by Adolf Hitler in and around Poland, concentration camps only are the Jews amounted to only a third of that number. We have the idea that the Holocaust was an entirely Jewish affair, but that's not the case. almost as many Jews as were killed, about 5.5 million, were political prisoners, and a lot of those were Polish Christians. And while we have some German Christians to mind, Maximilian Kolbe and Edith Stein, there are also a pile of Polish intellectuals who will ultimately be lost in the midst of that as well. And then, of course, as soon as that ends, the Russians will take over, and then they'll become the Soviets. And it's not going to be until the Solidarność movement ultimately takes down the Soviet communism in Warsaw without firing a bullet in the late 1980s that the Poles are independent for the first time. Now, this is all happening well after Faustina has gone to her reward, but you have to remember, these people now are looking around and saying, those were Nazi sympathizers, those were Russian sympathizers, those were Soviet sympathizers, these were the ones who did all these evil things. His grandfather worked at the concentration camp, her grandmother was killed there, and so there was a strong, incredibly strong need for this question of mercy in Poland, perhaps more than anywhere else in the world. And so we can see a lot of what's going on in the life of Faustina Kowalska is setting the stage for the incredible act of Christian forgiveness that is going to be called forth from the Polish people beginning in the mid-1990s, when they look around and have to deal with what the fact that they're independent really starts to mean. And so all of those things are context for Faustina Kowalska, who shows up on the scene. She's a mystic from a very young age. She is visited by Jesus at the age of 7. And she is told that she's going to be a nun and she needs to start getting ready for that. And so, of course, she's a little precocious 7-year-old who goes to mom and dad and says, I want to join the nunnery. And they go, that's a big negative, Ghost Rider. They don't know allowed to do that here in Poland until you're 18. And she's going, oh, that's a long time, as kids do. And so she consistently is kind of pushing to join the convent early, She's never really able to do it, but she finishes school at 16, which is when school ends in Poland, and she gets a job as a housekeeper, not in her relatively small hometown, but in the bigger city down the road. And again, it's pronounced Łódź or something, but I'm going to say Lodz. She sets up shop in Lodz as a housekeeper. She does this for a couple of years, but at the age of 18, which is still kind of young for her to become a nun, she has another vision of Jesus telling her to get on with it. It's time to get going. And so she goes and starts to, or she has this vision, I should say, at a park. She's there with her sister. They're walking and kind of just playing around in an outdoor park. And she has this vision in, what is the year? The year is, it's 1929, I believe. So she has this vision in a early kind of year. No, she's 18. 18 plus 5 is 23, 1923. And so she has this vision in a park, and she tells her sister, I've got to go become a nun, like right now. That's what the Lord is saying to me. And so she literally, without going home to pack her stuff, without anything, walks from the park to the train station, hops on the train to Warsaw, and when she gets there, she goes to the first church she sees. There's a mass going on, so she kneels down and attends mass, and then she catches the priest after and says, I'm supposed to become a nun. What do you think I should do about all that? The priest, who I imagine myself being, goes, I don't know. I've got lunch over, I got to eat. But anyway, okay, let's figure it out. So he sets her up with a devout kind of little widow lady in Warsaw, and she begins to go and visit convents and ask to be admitted. Now, the problem is, and this feels very weird for us, but in order to become a nun, the first step is to become a postulant, someone who is considering becoming a nun. And the thing is, convents, at that time at least, had a lot of postulants. And in fact, there were postulants who had no money, there were rich postulants, but the deal was, it's expensive to make fabric and make clothes for people, to house them for a year while they're kind of thinking about becoming a nun. And then if the order doesn't accept them, they've got to go somewhere else. And so it was the tradition then, as it's fairly common now, to say, you can't come to the convent unless you can pay your way for the first year, because you're just trying us on and we're trying you on, and this is not, a way to get a year of free food out of us. And so while that seems really harsh, the reality is only about 50-50, of women who enter convents become nuns, and it's the same thing with seminaries, and it's the same thing with monasteries. And so generally speaking, it costs a couple grand now. If you want to become a nun, you need to have some money, and you need to have your finances in relative state of stability, because the convent is going to expect some upfront cash. Seems harsh, but it's just the way it is. And it was that way as well in Poland. And so the reality was, she didn't have any coin. She didn't have any cash. And so she had to get a job there in Warsaw, and it took her about 9 months to put the money together to have a convent agree to take her in. And she ended up going with the convent of the Sisters of Our Lady of Mercy. Now, that was one of the convents she met very first thing. She met them in the first couple days she was there, but they said, you can't come back until you have the money. So go figure out how to get the money, and then you can become a nun here. And so she finally got the money together about 9 months after getting to Warsaw, and she becomes Sister Faustina of the Most Blessed Sacrament. And so she's late 20. She's about to be 21 when this happens, and there we go. Now, the order she joins is predominantly contemplative. They're a cloistered order. Each sister spends a lot of time in front of the Blessed Sacrament, and each sister does some basic labor in order to kind of help out with the kitchen or to clean up the gardens or whatever the case might be. And that's their day-to-day kind of rhythm, the ordo of life. Now, the closest person near to her ends up being her spiritual director, predominantly because she got moved around a lot. There were a lot of these so-called mercy houses, which what do they call their convents? And so she moved to 5 or 6 of these in the course of just a couple of years. And so her spiritual director, who is Father Michael Sopoczko, I think is the closest way to say it, Father Michael, Polish name. And so he doesn't know her from Adam. He's hearing confessions, and of course Fulton Sheen has the great quotation about hearing the confessions of nuns. It's like being stoned to death with cotton balls. All these little things. Oh, Father, the world is ending. I'm so terrible because I said my prayers without adequate attention, and you're going, I would kill to have the devotion that you have. So anyway, so she makes confession, and I'm sure in a line of 30 little nuns saying that they didn't pay adequate attention in chapel, this woman who comes in and says, I've been seeing Jesus appear to me since I was 7, and he recently appeared to me and said, I'm supposed to commission this piece of art, but I don't know how to paint, and I'm also supposed to commission this Chaplet of Divine Mercy thing to be said. He has got to think she's insane. And so he does. He calls up the local hospital and says, I need you to run by the convent and do a battery of tests on Sister Crazy Pants over there because she thinks she's seeing Jesus. And of course, he's much more reverent than that, but this is funnier to tell that way. And so the shrink drops by and does the evaluation, and it turns out she's sane as can be. And so he starts to go, maybe there's something to this. And so he has some meetings with her and kind of becomes a big supporter of hers. And it turns out that she had this vision about the painting several years earlier. It turns out that this Father Michael Polish name, is teaching at the local Polish name university. And so he knows this art master, this master art oil painter who teaches at the college. And so he says, hey, I need an oil painter who can make this happen. And so the oil painter is brought in and creates what we now know as the image of divine mercy. Now, if you've only ever seen the image of divine mercy that is very kind of evenly brown, and that has a very, very, very bright and sharp edge to both of the beams of light coming out of the heart of Jesus, that is a modern recreation. The initial one was very chiaroscuro. It's very dark and beautiful, and the image of Jesus is very bright, but all around it is quite dark, and then the beams coming out are in fact quite moving. It's an incredibly beautiful piece of art, but it's generally something that nowadays modern devotional representations of it are very, very cartoonish, whereas this one is very art master kind of thing. It's an incredibly beautiful piece. And if you've not seen the original, you can just you can go on Google and type in Divine Mercy Image Original, and it's very easy to find. And of course, in the image at the bottom, there's a bit of a scroll that says, Jesu ufam tobia, which is Jesus, I trust in you. And it's this incredibly simple but beautiful piece of art. And so this art master creates this, right, because of the Father Michael, a Polish name, getting involved. And the quotation that Sister Faustina wrote in her journal the night she received the image goes like this. It says, quote, Jesus orders you to paint an image according to the pattern you see with the signature, Jesus, I trust in you, Jesu ufam tobia. I desire that this image be venerated first in your chapel and then throughout the world. I promise that the soul that will venerate this image will not perish. And so we have this kind of remarkable thing where despite the fact she didn't paint, despite the fact that none of the sisters in the convent with her painted, she meets Father Michael. He thinks she's crazy. She proves she's not. He's able to put her in touch with an artist, and now things are moving right along. Now, we also get the usual pushback, right? Every story of the young nun meets Jesus. Jesus tells her to create some remarkable worldwide devotion, of which there are more than you might think. Those stories always have the same basic pattern. The sister receives this. She prays about it. She tells her spiritual director. Usually he thinks she's crazy. Then he gets on board. Mother Superior finds out. Mother Superior thinks she's crazy. Then give it a little while. Mother Superior gets on board. Then the bishop finds out. Bishop thinks she's crazy. Then the bishop ultimately gets on board. It always works the same way. And it worked the same way here. It took about 2 or 3 years for things to kind of come together, but then after it comes together, it starts to move really quite quickly. And so Father Michael writes up a pamphlet with a printed image of the Divine Mercy on the front, and he explains how to say the Chaplet of Divine Mercy. And then after that gets done, it is ultimately given the special permission or the imprimatur of the local bishop, or technically of the bishop's Nikolobstot, but you don't need to know that. If you ever look this up, you'll find some random Polish name followed by the letter C and then a much longer Polish name that explains this is the imprimatur. And so don't worry about the details of it. But Father Michael puts this pamphlet together, everybody approves it, and suddenly it becomes this big deal. And all the people in the local community now of central Poland and around Krakow in southern Poland are just itching to say the Chaplet of Divine Mercy. The novena comes along a little bit later. And again, Father Michael is going to help when Faustina says, this Jesus wants this, and he says, okay, I'll make it happen. Now, by this time, okay, this is all happening in the early 1930s, 1930, 31. But by this time, a young boy living in the area had become utterly enamored by the devotion and by the image. And he was born in 1920, and his contact with the image and the chaplet was extensive, but he never, to my knowledge, had a chance to meet the nun herself. And of course, I'm talking about Charlie, or Karol Wojtyła, who would go on to become the Bishop of Krakow in 1958 and would remain there until 1978 as the Archbishop, when he ultimately changed his name to Pope John Paul II and had to move from the delightful and beautiful village-like, wonderful city of Krakow to Rome, which got great food, but otherwise, I don't know why you'd want to do that. But at any rate, Faustina is going to die very young. She's going to die at the age of 33, and she's going to die in 1938, which means that she had only had about 6 or 7 years to kind of put all these things in place before she dies from tuberculosis, of all things, very much like Saint Therese of Lisieux dies at the age of 24 from tuberculosis. So John Paul II becomes the cheerleader of the Chaplet of Divine Mercy. He is going to become a huge advocate of it as a young man, and then certainly as he watches World War II rage around him and the Nazi occupations and all that, he leans more and more upon the image of Divine Mercy as a way of kind of holding on to his Polishness. And he's doing this while he's also part of the Polish resistance. He's going to play a major role ultimately in the fall of communism much later, but but he is, like the other Polish people, very, very attached to the image of divine mercy. Now, around the same time that John Paul is really coming of age, there is an approval by a bishop and ultimately of a pope, by the Pope, of an order, a religious order that does nothing but the devotion to the divine mercy as it was taught by Sister Faustina. And then in 1965, a couple of years later, John Paul II is going to open the cause for the canonization of Sister Faustina. And so that's the basic outline. She's a little girl with a very strong mystical kind of sense. She's not able to join the convent for several years. When she is able to join, she kind of leaves suddenly and unexpectedly. She has to get some money together. She joins the convent, and then she has a relatively straightforward process of, these are the three things the Lord wants. He wants the image, he wants the chaplet, he wants the novena, and then she finds a spiritual director who promptly helps her with that. There is some little bit of friction, but ultimately all the things come together, and it all works together very, very nicely. And of course, the person who canonized her as a saint is the same person who opened her cause in 1965, Pope St. John Paul II. And of course, he dies in the year 2005, on the eve, on the vigil of the Feast of Divine Mercy, which he had established, again, at Sister Faustina's urging, because in the diary she says the Lord wants Low Sunday, the Sunday after Easter, to be the Sunday of Divine Mercy, and he was able to put that in place in the year 2000, 5 years before his own death. Now, just to make sure we're clear, it's not been smooth sailing all the way through, though. There was limited pushback on the devotion in lots of places here and there there continues to be some limited pushback from good and faithful Catholics in various places, almost exclusively not because of the devotion itself, but because ultimately most of the problems people have arise from the attempts in the last 75 years or so to redefine what mercy means. Mercy is relief from punishment deserved. That's what mercy is. I deserve punishment. I did the crime. I committed the sin. I deserve to be punished. But mercy is a compassionate, loving pardon from the truthful justice that I deserve. It's not mercy if I don't go to jail because I didn't kill somebody. It's not mercy if it turns out the law has changed and now what I did is considered acceptable. It's not even mercy if it turns out that the cop has just kind of set the alarm on his speedometer to 9 over the limit and I'm blasting by at 7 over the limit. That's not mercy. That's just the law being changed or not enforced. Mercy is when I did the thing, I deserve the punishment, but as an act of love, someone says they're not going to punish me as I deserve. And so divine mercy, as the prayers imply, is requested in atonement for our sins and the sins of the whole world. And so it is not about saying something isn't a sin. It's not about protecting someone's feelings. Mercy can only exist to be extended to the person who is sorry for their sins and who deserves punishment. The problem arises in that lots of people nowadays, including Pope Francis, claim that saying X or Y is a sin is somehow unmerciful. People saying that, this and that and the other, it's not merciful to say this is a sin, or to say if you're remarried, you can't, if you're remarried invalidly, you can't receive Holy Communion. There's nothing unmerciful about that. It may be uncharitable, it may be unkind, it may not be meek, it may be pastorally ineffective. But in fact, it may not be helpful at all to hurt someone's feelings or challenge them in this moment or that. That's fine to say, but those things are not about mercy. And so more and more clergy, as more and more clergy and theological writing are misappropriating the word mercy. and attaching to it all kinds of other things that have nothing to do with it, there is a growing concern about the potential for misunderstanding what mercy is. And of course, this was a problem we saw in the 60s, where people were talking about justice all the time, having no idea what actual social justice was, till we reached the point that we said, oh gosh, every time we talk about injustice, that's social justice, and that's simply wrong. And what ended up happening is we lost the entire Catholic tradition of social justice because the word had been deteriorated by people who thought they were doing something helpful. And that's the problem we have nowadays. The word mercy has become synonymous with being nice, and that's not helpful. And so there is some concern about overhyping divine mercy when ultimately you have people high up in the church who are misunderstanding, deliberately or not, what mercy is. And I've heard plenty of sermons personally on divine mercy, which end up saying God just wants us to be nice to each other. And that's all he's really looking for. And so that's a problem. It's a significant problem. If we talk about God's divine mercy as a way of saying we're not allowed to talk about the gospel, we have big problems. So there are some folks who say it is not the right time to preach the gospel of mercy because it's being so misappropriated that we need to kind of give it some air and stop talking about mercy in this way and use different language, different verbiage to teach that same theological idea. Divine mercy, as it was given to Faustina, has nothing to do with any of that. Divine mercy, as it was given to Faustina, assumes the proper understanding of mercy, and it's good stuff. It's incredibly good stuff. If you want to read the diary of divine mercy, it's wonderful. Now, the only kind of note that I would add at this point is it's all in Polish. You translate Polish into English, it doesn't make it any easier, it just makes it English. And so Polish is a very, very difficult language to get. The way that the words and sentences are phrased is challenging. And the way most Polish literature is written is you have an idea, and the way it works is you have somebody who says something about it like here, and then something totally different here, and then something totally different here, and you kind of swirl around to get toward the center of an idea, and it's very, very hard to follow the train of thought that Faustina has in the Diary of Divine Mercy. It's doable. I read it when I was 15. It's not like it's beyond the scope of reading. It's just difficult because Polish and the entire Polish way of thinking is very different. It's a little bit German and a little bit Russian, and you know both those are great, easy languages to read and understand. And so if you imagine, Tolstoy and his very, very inaccessible prose, and you think about someone like Immanuel Kant and his utterly inconceivable philosophy, and you say, let's just mix those together randomly with a little bit of Italian and a little bit of Czech, and you go, that's going to be a hoot. So it's a tough read, but not something that's undoable. You just kind of have to set yourself and say, I'm going to read a chapter of the diary this evening, and I'm going to have to focus to do it. It's not like a Sue Grafton novel. You really do have to focus pretty hard. So the devotion, that said, consists broadly in three parts. We have the image, we have the chaplet, and we have the novena. Now, understood rightly, they are powerful and effective tools for growing in holiness. Personally, you'll notice I don't talk about the novena much. I don't personally like the novena. I'm not a saint, so you don't need to listen to my advice or opinion on that in any way, shape, or form. The only reason I don't like it is because I grew up, spiritually speaking, the monastery I went to treated the Triduum of Easter as a big, big, big deal. And so in my spiritual life, the Triduum is a big deal, and anything that reduces Good Friday or Holy Saturday to day 1 or day 2 of something just kind of gives me the willies. That is not spiritual advice for you. You pray whatever it is the Lord wants you to pray, but I just don't preach about the novena much because I don't like that. It just doesn't set right with me. But again, I'm not a saint. That's a personal hang up. You do you, and let the Holy Spirit lead and guide you. The chaplet itself, though, I think is beautiful, and the image is wonderful. In my previous parish, I was able to install a gorgeous 3.5, 4 foot tall image of the original painting that is still there today, and it's just beautiful, just beautiful. If there's any interest, we can certainly install one here. They're not all that expensive. We just don't have a lot of space in our sanctuary to put more stuff. But if there's interest, just let me know. So that is the Chaplet of Divine Mercy, at least a very simple overview of the kind of context working around it and what the story is with the devotion to Divine Mercy. If you have any questions or comments, you're welcome to send them in to me via the usual channels. I've been Father Ryan Humphries. This has been the CU Catecast, and I hope you have a great afternoon.